Hello everyone, welcome and thank you for joining us. It's fantastic to see lots of clients and partners joining us again. Also great to see some new names too, so welcome to everyone. My name is Richard McLeod. I'm a Senior Client and Strategy Director for Metrics Lab based here in the UK. And I'm joined by Bish Chatterjee, a Director in our Singapore business. Together, we will be sharing the findings from the second wave of our Understanding the New Normal global consumer tracking program. We'll be presenting for around 30 minutes or so. So that should leave 5 or 10 minutes at the end for some Q&A. So if any questions do come to mind as we run through the session, please pop them into the question box, which you should see on the right-hand side of your page, and we'll get to as many of those as we can at the end. So if we could start by just casting our minds back to April. In last month's webinar, a number of key themes emerged that I think it would be worthwhile me just quickly recapping for you. So first of all, we saw that people were remarkably optimistic about a quick return to normality. Secondly, we saw some fantastic examples of consumer resourcefulness and creativity in the face of adversity. And that was particularly the case, I think, in terms of the way that people were using and engaging with brands. And ultimately, we identified some huge opportunities for brands to play a positive role during this crisis. We talked about the idea that now was the time for brands to move beyond superficially offering sympathy, understanding, and togetherness, and actually brands could play a much bigger role and provide information, inspiration, and entertainment. As a tracker, a number of these topics remain at the core of our program, but we are also trying to be quite agile. So we're trying to focus on new areas as the situation evolves and new client questions emerge. Today, we are addressing 3 core questions. So first of all, how far are we from normal? Is there a sense that people think we are progressing closer to normality? And if so, what does that mean for people's feelings and emotions? Secondly, how are priorities changing? Where are people's worries and concerns focused? And does this have implications for brands? And finally, what does the next phase look like? So we know that the situation around the world is fragmented, it's changing very quickly. Does this mean that emotional needs are also changing? And ultimately, what does that mean for brands in terms of how they communicate and how they engage with their target audience? Again, though, overall, it's really encouraging to see that brands still have a really positive role to play during this crisis. There are big opportunities for brands to connect with people in useful and meaningful ways. I won't dwell for too long on the method, but there were a couple of points that I wanted to reinforce. So first of all, the information that we are sharing today was collected in May. Again, it's very important to us that we are providing a holistic perspective. So we're taking the survey data from the tracking program and piecing that together with social insights, trusted external data, and also hopefully some inspiring brand case studies as well. That 360 view is really helpful because it helps us to see what people are doing and how they're feeling, but also where can brands intersect. We're covering 17 markets, so that gives us really good geographical coverage, but also I think quite a strong range of countries that are at different life stages in terms of the pandemic. Those comparisons across countries can be really useful because it gives us a sense of how the situation is likely to evolve over time. So now we'll head into the findings and we'll start with a perspective around how far people think we are from normal. Last time, as I say, there was a huge amount of optimism for a very, very quick recovery. So is that still there? And this is a really core part of our programme and something that we intend to monitor over the coming months. So we begin by asking to what extent people feel that life is already returning to normal. We can read this chart from left to right. So that means that the further to the right-hand side a country flag is, the closer to normality the people in that country feel they are. Overall, we get a real sense of progress. So that global average has advanced by 6 percentage points. That means that across our 17 countries, people do feel that we are gradually getting closer to normality. But we still see a real range across our different countries. And once again, we do get a bit of a west to east pattern. So countries like China, Vietnam, India, Thailand, these are the countries that currently feel closest to normal, and they contrast quite sharply with some of our Western markets, markets like the US, UK, Italy and Spain. These are the countries that were perhaps hit worst by the pandemic, and they still feel far from normal. The extremities on this page can also be quite instructive. So Vietnam, for example, is a country that continues to be in a very strong position. It's a country that has managed the crisis extremely well. And up until recently, actually, Vietnam had just over 300 cases and 0 deaths. So I think that is reflected in the high level of consumer confidence that we see in Vietnam. Compare that with Brazil. Brazil is now the country that feels furthest away from normal. And at the time of research in May, Brazil really was heading towards the peak of the pandemic. Brazil now has the 4th highest death toll globally, unfortunately. And also we have seen a high level of criticism around how the Brazilian government has handled the crisis. So I think that is reflected in the declining confidence levels that we are seeing in Brazil. Overall, though, I think it remains clear that the situation around the world continues to be fragmented. It's changing all the time. And that means that our point of view remains the same. Businesses should be setting themselves up to be agile. Businesses need to be in a position to evolve their approach in line with a changing situation in each country. But overall, we do get this sense of progress, and I think that is reflected in the significant changes that we're seeing in terms of how people are feeling. So as restrictions slowly start to lift in many countries around the world, we do get this sense that joy or joyfulness is rising significantly month on month, but also a lot of those negative emotions are subsiding as well. It is, of course, worth noting that of the emotions that we're showing on this page, the 2 emotions of caution and feeling anxious, these are the top 2 emotions felt. So I think perhaps the best way to describe this is what we're seeing is a rise of cautious optimism around the world. Again, we see that high degree of confidence in Vietnam, where positive emotions really are significantly on the rise. But also it's really nice to see that in Spain, a country that of course was one of the worst hit by the pandemic, really encouraging to see that positive emotions are now on the rise again in that country as well. So this is a topic that we will return to later. We are increasingly finding that staying close to the changing emotional needs of people as we move through different phases of this pandemic, that is becoming an increasingly important opportunity for brands. So we've identified this idea of a rising cautious optimism, and I think that is also reflected in the greater sense of realism we see around how long people think it will take for us to return to normality. So last month we saw that half of people globally felt that there would be a return to normal within 3 months. That has now reduced significantly to 38%. So most markets, with the exception of Vietnam and Australia, have seen a significant decline in that metric. So even though we are seeing this overall sense of progress and rising positivity, at the same time we're seeing this growing acceptance from people that there is a long road ahead. And that road to recovery is likely to be a marathon rather than a sprint. This is a perspective that we've seen reinforced across lots of the data sources. So, for example, the other day I read in McKinsey's Global Consumer Sentiment Tracker that it reveals a very, very similar picture. People are feeling more positive, they do see progress, but at the same time there is this acceptance that we have a long road ahead of us. So we know that the impact of this pandemic, particularly on lifestyles and routines, is likely to be very long lasting. That means that brands have to be able to adapt, they have to be able to refine their plans to engage effectively as we continue to move through this crisis over the coming months. So now I'll hand you over to Bish, who's going to talk us through how people's priorities are changing and how brands can adapt.
Thanks, Rich. Hi, everyone. Hopefully you can see my screen all well. My name is Bish, and I'll talk you through this next section. Rich has obviously talked about, how people are settling in for the marathon, as he's called it, and it's not really a sprint about when things will get back to normal. People are taking baby steps to getting back to normal. This section, what we look at is how are people's priorities changing? What's top of mind in terms of their worries? How is that impacting in terms of how they feel? And also obviously in their brand choices. So on this slide, what we see are the top worries on people's minds. So last month, we had seen this trend about a whole we versus me phenomenon, where people were very concerned about their family's physical health. And that was the top worry on people's mind in April. That still continues to be one of the top worries. But what I want to draw your attention to and spend a bit of time on is where you see my household finances. That worry has climbed to the top of the charts and is the most critical worry on people's minds right now. And as marketeers, we are bombarded by numbers from the World Economic Forum has downgraded GDP forecasts. Uh, the World Trade Organization is saying that global trade will fall by about 1/3 this fiscal year. Those are staggering numbers. And obviously, what is happening is that is having an impact on the everyday consumer whose livelihoods are at stake. There are job losses happening, there are job cuts happening. So clearly, people are under the pump on that scenario. Now, you see that as a trend which is even more pronounced in countries like India, Thailand, and we'll come to that in the next slide on a bit more detail. What's interesting is this trend of China, Vietnam, like Rich talked about on the first slide, who are feeling a lot closer to normal, right? And you're seeing economic activities picking up, lockdown restrictions are being removed. So clearly there's a positive sentiment. And in China, you're seeing how people are resorting to retail therapy to gain a sense of normalcy. And you see this rise in the term called revenge spending, which we've all quite come to admire, which is people are saying, you know what, I was locked down for 2.5 months. I will go out there and splurge on luxury goods. So clearly a very different sentiment for us from the rest of the world, where people are grappling with worries on household finances. My family's physical health continues to be a top worry, but we do see a decline of about 4% globally on that. And that's not surprising with infections stabilizing, plateauing, number of deaths going down. The recovery rate, according to the WHO, has gone up from 82% to 88% April versus May. So clearly, it's a worry which is starting to plateau, and it's something that we'll continue to track over the next few months to see how that goes. So coming back to India and Thailand that we see on this slide, again, we've seen that how the impact of COVID-19 on economies, especially developing economies, is really stringent. And these are economies which depend a lot on the informal sector. So, for example, Thailand, an economy which is very dependent on tourism. Their exports are dependent on automotive exports, electronic exports, and you've got global trade, global travel that has really gone down significantly and has impacted a country like Thailand. You've got India, a country of 1.2 billion people, under one of the most extensive lockdowns for almost 2.5 months. Construction was stopped. All their malls were shut. Even all the factories were shut. So clearly, it's had a huge impact on people working in the informal sector in these economies. And when you look at, some of the consumer verbatims that start to come through in the survey, it's a bit disheartening also. So for example, if you look at the quote from someone in Thailand who's saying, there's no money to pay for my home's energy costs, they need to be paid every month. Or someone from India who's talking about, I feel I can be laid off, also there can be pay cuts and I have to take care of my family. So clearly very basic human fears are coming to the forefront right now under the scenario where clearly people's incomes are under pressure. Now, this whole topic about jobs, if we see, is not a topic that's only limited to the developing economies. It's there across countries. So our social insights team picked up some interesting top hashtags from last month and what people were talking about. And you see that this whole theme and the talk about job or work is there across a lot of countries. We've picked up two different flavors to give you a sense of what's coming through. So on the left, you've got the top hashtags in the US, where amongst others, work is one of them. And if you look at the, we've been reading up on articles, and again, citing McKinsey Consulting's report on May 11th, which is talking about almost 57 million US jobs are currently vulnerable to job cuts, furloughs, reduced hours. So clearly, when the US consumers are talking about work, they're talking about in a context of where they're anxious, where they are scared of what's going to happen with their jobs, with their work and their incomes. Cut to China, a very different flavor. Again, jobs is one of the top 5 topics people are talking about, but in a very different context. People are saying, okay, I'm going back to work. How should I work with the new restrictions? What should I be careful of? What is this new normal, new ways of working? So still talking about jobs work itself, but in a very different and a very positive sentiment. Like I personally was so happy to see an out of office email from my colleagues in China, which said, "Hi, I'm out of office for a client meeting." I was like, wow, when can I have that? Seems like a completely different dimension. So you see different countries reacting in a very different way and having different priorities on their minds right now. Now, what you also see is, we ask consumers, has your income gone up or down compared to last month? And what you see on the left is a staggering 39%, which is about 2 out of 5 people across 17 countries that we've talked to have said that my income has gone down compared to last month in May versus April. And it is an even higher number in countries like Indonesia, France, Switzerland as well. So again, we were doing a bit of digging on Switzerland. So we were reading on Credit Suisse reports, the economic ministry reports, which are talking about the deep recession that at the moment Switzerland is in. Again, a country that's heavily dependent on tourism and exports, clearly suffering. Now, at a time when 2 out of 5 people are saying that, my income has decreased, you can imagine from an emotional perspective, they are saying that I'm feeling a lot more anxious. Clearly, there's, anxiety levels are going up and a lot less positive. So as a brand owner, we have to be cognizant about this very real world fear that a lot of our consumers are living in right now. And how is it that, we should adapt our tonality and communications when we are trying to, talk to them about our brands or trying to support them in general. Now, this whole unfavorable scenario about incomes reducing, pressure on, the economic worries manifests itself when we look at brand choices. So we've got two parts to the slide. On the left, you've got the group of people who are saying that my income has remained the same or increased. And on the right, the group of people who've said that my income has decreased. Now, we look at, what are the types of brands that they are most likely to choose. So the basic brand pillars around local brands, trusted brands, environmentally friendly brands, they remain consistent from last month. What does make an appearance now is cost-effective brands. Cost-effective brands was not in the top 5 in April. It's come through in May amongst the group who are saying that my income has remained same and increased. And it's gone a notch higher to number 4 for people who are saying that my income has decreased. Coupled with the fact, if you notice, high quality brands has actually dropped down out of the top 5 for the group on the right, which means you've got a group of consumers whose income is under pressure and are more likely to switch quality versus cost effectiveness. Their frugality will come to the forefront. They're more than happy to switch to a cost effective brand than a high quality brand. And it's a trend we see that's coming through even more strongly in a country like India. Now, given these pillars that you could look to activate and stay close to consumers, we'll look at a few examples of how some of these brands are doing it. It's again a part of our initiative when we try and come back to you with external inspirational cases as well. So Bacardi, who is trying to build trust by helping their bartender network, they're doing significant donations, so they're in it with them right now. You've got Zappos.com, an online retailer who has started a unique customer service for anything. And it literally is customer service for anything. You can call them up for whatever you want, even if it is just to talk to someone. That's how they are trying to build trust. There's this unique story which I read, which talked about how a doctor was, at his wit's end trying to get ventilator clips and he didn't know where to get them from. And he called this hotline, and believe it or not, they were able to help him. So clearly a very different way of brand is trying to build trust. You've got FMCG companies like Nestle and Kellogg's who are focusing on the value equation part of it, obviously trying to roll out a lot more affordable pack sizes. Kellogg's is looking at the number of servings that a box of cereals could potentially provide. So clearly these are elements they want to drive with consumers when it comes to the value equation. So different brands, different strategies, going back to those themes around local brands, trusted brands, and getting the value equation right. Sort of the last couple of slides in this section. On this slide, what we look at is how are businesses and brands adapting right now, and what are they doing, and what do consumers want from them? The top one we see, businesses should focus their resources on helping people during this pandemic. That continues across the globe, not a surprise. But what's also heartening to see is number 2. when a consumer is saying it is okay for businesses to advertise their products in the current situation at 65% and a significant increase over April, consumers are even more open right now for us to talk to them about our brands and products. So you have that creative license as a brand owner to go out there, talk to your consumers, and really talk about your products and services because they have an open mind right now. And as we sort of move closer to normal, this will get even stronger over time. However, a big watch out for us is point 4, which is you should not come across as opportunistic at this point of time. Consumers are saying, yes, talk to me, I'm happy to hear you, but don't come across as opportunistic. And we see that is rising, especially in countries like India, Indonesia, Vietnam, where people are saying that a lot of brands are coming across as trying to, being very opportunistic right now. Couple of examples of what we've seen globally. So Pepsi on the left has been doing a lot of donations and really contributing significantly in this fight against COVID-19. They, however, were caught in an unfortunate situation where they put their brand and logo on a COVID testing site. And despite all of their positive efforts, this one just blew up. And there was a backlash on social media. People started talking about it. Ultimately, Pepsi had to withdraw the ad. Think about a situation where consumers are saying, go ahead, advertise to me, but you risk significant equity erosion if you are called out as being someone who's really trying to take advantage of the situation. Marks and Spencer, a retailer in the UK as well, were again called out on social media for selling hand sanitizers at twice or more than twice the average market price. Again, consumers at this point of time will call you out if you come across as someone who's trying to take advantage of the situation. So as brand owners, we keep in mind, happy to talk to consumers right now. Consumers are willing to listen to us, but be careful that we don't come across as opportunistic. With that, I hand it back to Rich, who will talk to you about, what the next phase looks like, and of course, what the key actions that brands should keep in mind in the coming month.
Thank you, Bish. So in the final section, we will be exploring the next phase. So which new behaviours are emerging? How can brands stay close to people as we move through different phases of the pandemic? So firstly, we have seen some quite rapid shifts in terms of how people are spending their time as some countries start to emerge from lockdown restrictions. So last month, for those of you who joined us for our previous webinar, when I talked to you about the activities that were on the rise in April, those activities I think were reflective of a more housebound captive audience. People were spending more time tidying and cleaning, they were watching more entertainment content, and people were picking up new hobbies such as arts and crafts. These activities are now subsiding, and this coincides with people getting more active, people heading outside again. So for example, outdoor sports is significantly on the rise in May. Spain is a really good example of this. So in Spain, it's been really widely reported that in that country, of course, a country that was badly hit by the pandemic, had quite a strict lockdown for around 2 months. As those lockdown restrictions were lifted, people in Spain were very, very quick to get back to outdoor physical activity as soon as possible. So I think this is a really useful reminder that lots of those new behaviours that we have seen in the last few weeks, of course, they were the function of imposed restrictions, and many aspects of life will return to normal in the next few months. And I think this is reinforced when we ask people what they are looking forward to doing most once the world returns to normal. What we can see is a really clear appetite for people to return to their pre-COVID-19 activities. But an interesting dynamic, I think, is that increasingly we are seeing that spending time with loved ones, so seeing people that you haven't been able to see during the pandemic, this is increasingly emerging as the #1 priority for people across the world. And that's very, very true across lots of different contexts and lots of different situations. So if we take Australia, for example, Australia was a country that perhaps wasn't quite as badly hit by the pandemic as some other countries around the world. And also Australia was a country that was able to ease restrictions ahead of many other markets. The top activity that people are looking forward to doing most in May in Australia is spending time with loved ones. Compare that with India, where the context is very different. So India remains in one of the longest and the strictest lockdowns around the world. Also, that lockdown was very suddenly imposed. And in India, we have the added challenge that lots of people work away from home. Domestic travel has been banned. These people haven't been able to get home to see their families and see their loved ones. So when we ask the same question to people in India, again, the number one thing that people are looking forward to is traveling domestically. But that, of course, is with that ultimate goal of getting back home and spending time with people that you haven't been able to see. So, of course, as we all know, spending time with loved ones, socializing, these are universal human desires, things that have been badly affected by the pandemic in lots of different ways in lots of different countries. So as this becomes possible again, as restrictions start to lift, this I think is the most important milestone on the road to recovery. And clearly it's a big opportunity for brands to celebrate that in meaningful ways. But this doesn't mean that people will be rushing back to all of their activities the moment that lockdown is lifted. So this is a question where we asked people who are looking forward to certain activities at what point they would feel confident doing those activities again. If we look first at the top half of the chart, so the area that's in blue, here we have a range of activities that people intend to return to quite quickly once lockdown is lifted and basic safety measures are met. So activities like going to the gym, going to pubs, going shopping again, getting your hair cut, as well as getting back to work and spending time with loved ones. These are perceived by people to be the essentials that they can't live without. And again, I think they can become really small milestones on that road to recovery that brands can play a role in terms of facilitating and celebrating. But then we compare that with the bottom half of the chart, the area in yellow. These, for many people, are the more non-essential activities that people feel less confident about returning to swiftly. So these are things like concerts, live sports events, going to the cinema. There is a suggestion that for these experiences, people will need very, very clear reassurance on the safety steps that are being taken. And in the meantime, perhaps there is a need and also an opportunity for businesses and brands to reimagine some of these experiences to help people recreate an experience without feeling unsafe. So we have two instructive examples where we have seen this happening already. So first of all, from the world of live sports, as we saw on the previous page, there is some reluctance from people to attend live sports matches at the moment. That is a reluctance that is shared by the authorities. So we see many examples around the world of live sport returning, but doing so in empty stadiums. In Japan, we've seen some fantastic innovation around this problem. So there's an app that's been created that brings the live fan experience into your home. So it allows people to boo and cheer their team via their smartphones. And then that sound is played real time to players via speakers in the stadium. A second example that we've seen that has perhaps emerged a little bit more organically in the US is around going to the cinema. So going to the cinema, of course, another activity that people are really looking forward to doing, but there is still some reluctance about doing that amongst movie fans. In the meantime, we've seen the resurgence of drive-in movie theatres in the US, and a lot of businesses have been very, very quick to jump on this trend. So we are now seeing pop-up drive-in theatres emerging in car parks in different places around the US. So clearly, for innovative businesses and innovative brands, there is this opportunity to reimagine experiences, to keep people engaged during what is still quite a tentative time, and ultimately fuel that demand, ready for a time when things do truly return to normal. Another significant opportunity we've seen is that brands can try to stay close to how emotional needs are changing through different phases of this pandemic and then respond accordingly. So to help demonstrate this opportunity, we've created two clusters of countries. The first market cluster on the left-hand side of your page, at the time of research, these were countries that remained in lockdown. So a lot of the restrictions were maintained during these countries during April. We compare that to the second cluster of countries on the right-hand side of your page. These are countries where lockdown restrictions had already lifted or they were beginning to lift. First of all, what we can do is compare these countries in terms of how their emotional needs are changing. It will come as no surprise, that in countries where the restrictions were still being maintained, we saw negative emotions on the rise. And actually you also saw hopefulness, and this sense of hope was subsiding in that country cluster. Compare that to markets where restrictions were being lifted, and we see positive emotions on the rise in those countries. So things like excitement, joy, positivity, really increasing significantly compared to April. But what's really important is that this then translates into changing needs from brands. So looking first of all at that market cluster where restrictions are being maintained, what we see is a real focus on that immediate need for fun and distraction. So people are looking for brands to help them forget about the virus and to provide some entertainment. In countries where restrictions are lifting, people are very, very quick to be able to look towards the future again. And people are increasingly open to messages around sustainability, but also messages around how to live more healthily. So this is really important for businesses. It represents a huge opportunity for brands to stay close to people and then ultimately adapts that content, adapts that messaging in line with changing needs as the situation in each country changes. And we've got some fantastic examples of brands that have addressed that phase one need for fun and distraction extremely well. So first of all, we have Heinz. So Heinz launched its Heinz ketchup puzzle. This was a puzzle with 570 pieces that ultimately created a big ketchup red rectangle. This is a fantastic example of meeting that lockdown need for fun and distraction extremely well. Also, what's really nice about this example is that Heinz is leveraging a distinctive brand asset really effectively. At the same time, we've seen some fantastic work from Burger King in a number of European markets. Again, this is something that's gained a lot of social engagement. So in Germany, we saw an in-restaurant activation using a social distancing crown. And then in Italy, we've seen the launch of the heavily onioned social distancing Whopper. So these are really good fun, entertaining activations, but also, again, drawing on distinctive brand assets for Burger King. So I think these are really good examples to draw inspiration from for brands that are operating in markets that are still heavily restricted and still in that phase one lockdown situation. But then as we move into the next phase of the pandemic, restrictions begin to lift and people can quite quickly start to look towards the future again. One example of this that we've identified through social insights is that people are increasingly wanting to take better care of themselves. So we know that cooking at home has been a key trend, but initially that was very, very focused on people treating themselves with sugary and baked goods. A lot of us will have seen the quarantine 15 hashtag gaining popularity. That was a way of poking fun at people gaining weight during lockdown. But now people are looking towards the future again. People are seeking inspiration around how to be more healthy and how to live a more balanced lifestyle. And at the moment, this is quite a big and also largely untapped opportunity for brands. So brands really should be exploring how they can play a role here, but also how can they identify the other needs that are emerging as we move into this next phase of the pandemic. So we'll finish by recapping some of this month's key themes and then outline some of the implications for brands. So first of all, we have seen that this road to recovery is likely to be a long one, and we are seeing increasing acceptance of that from people around the world. So the theme we've identified, I think, is a rise of cautious optimism amongst people in different countries. Also, we've seen that the focus of worries has very, very quickly changed. So people are now worried by, but also directly impacted by the COVID-19 recession. So that means that things like cost, value, and fairness are rising up the consumer agenda. Thirdly, we're seeing that brands are coming under increasing scrutiny, and people are now hypersensitive to any degree of brand opportunism, and that means there is a real need for brands to be transparent and purposeful. As we are making progress along that road to recovery and people start to re-emerge, what we're seeing is that they are naturally gravitating towards the things that they can't live without. And number one on that list is reconnecting with loved ones. So clearly, these are going to be powerful moments to be celebrated. And finally, we're seeing that emotional needs are changing as we move through new phases of the pandemic. This has really important implications for consumer insight and brand strategy. And really, it's a big opportunity for brands who are able to respond to that. So what does this all mean for brands? What are the actions that brands should be taking? So first of all, we have this long road to recovery ahead of us. That means that there will be many moments along the way that signpost our progress. So brands should be exploring ways to support and celebrate those moments in meaningful ways. Secondly, we're seeing that value, now more than ever, is absolutely crucial. Brands should be looking to get that value equation right, find ways to make people's lives a little bit easier during this time. Also, it's really important to avoid being seen as opportunistic at all costs. Now is the time for brands to communicate with authenticity and purpose, and there are lots of opportunities for brands to play a positive role during this time. People are really keen to get back to some of their favourite activities, but also there is a high degree of caution still there amongst many consumers around the world. Brands can innovate and reimagine these experiences to engage people in the short term, and I think that's particularly important in the live event space. And I think brands have a really big role to play there to unlock demand. And finally, we know that emotional needs are changing. Brands have to stay close to that. They have to keep their finger on the pulse. And that then becomes a big opportunity for businesses to adapt, meet those changing needs, and communicate and engage with your target audience more meaningfully. So I think that's now a good moment to pause and answer some of the questions that we've been receiving. So thank you to everyone who has posted a question. Lots of really good questions coming through. So I wish I had a bit more time, but we'll get to a few of those. I think I will pose the first question to Bish, if that's okay, Bish. This is a question around Vietnam. So the question we are seeing is, it was surprising to see that Vietnam was so close to getting back to normal. So specifically, what have they done in Vietnam to combat the COVID-19 pandemic so successfully?
Interesting one. In fact, I think in stuff, materials that I've been reading, a couple of countries potentially can be looked at along with Vietnam. I think the other one was Taiwan as well, another country in Asia who's managed to contain the virus really well. And again, looking at Taiwan, obviously we are not covering in our survey at the moment, but looking at Vietnam specifically, I think they had sort of broadly three things. Firstly, they had, I think, started off containing the virus well before their first case had come up, as per the articles. I think based on cases they were seeing in China at that time, they started enforcing lockdowns and restrictions. So they started off early. The other bit I remember seeing also is this whole bit about contact tracing, which we here in Singapore, in a smaller nation, we've seen it being done extensively. Vietnam also did that pretty extensively. Once their cases started, they were able to do contact tracing very extensively and quarantine people who were potential, cases. And of course, the other bit, of course, is, they had a lot of learnings from when the SARS virus had hit them also a few years back. So clearly the government has used its machinery and, the whole bit around there where they're very close to people on the ground to communicate about hazards, health hazards, best practices, what to do in the virus. So clearly the government learned their lesson very well from past experiences and ended up deploying that proactively at very early stages. And that has helped them sort of contain the virus. And which is obviously, now they're reaping the benefits of thinking about domestic tourism, thinking about tourists from China potentially, businesses opening up. So clearly an example of a job well done by the government, which a lot of other countries can borrow from.
Great, thank you, Bish. We have a second question around outdoor sports. So this is related to the idea that it's great to see that people are doing outdoor sports more frequently again. And this person is wondering specifically which sports people are doing. So I'll take this question. I think first of all, it's important to say that in our new normal tracker, actually we don't delve into the details of specifically which sports people are doing. But again, we can draw on some external sources that I've been reading. So I think, as would make intuitive sense, actually, people have been gravitating towards sports that are more individual in nature. So we're seeing examples around the world of people getting back to doing walking, cycling, jogging, golf, I think is coming through. I saw in Spain that in coastal areas people are swimming and surfing again. So really, it's the sports that people can do whilst maintaining social distancing, I guess. Probably the other thing that connects to this is the theme we picked up on earlier. So people are looking towards the future again in many countries. They are trying to be more healthy. Part of that is exercising. So people are looking towards things that help them to stay fit and exercise again. Of course, I guess we would imagine as things start to relax, people will start to gravitate towards more group-oriented sports again. We're probably not seeing that yet, but it'll be interesting to see how this progresses and evolves in the coming weeks. Okay, probably time for just one more question. So Bish, I'll pose this one to you again. This is around this idea that people are really focused on reconnecting with loved ones. The question really is how are people looking to reconnect? Are they looking for a big party, a big celebration, or is it going to be something more low-key?
That's a good one. Like, yeah, I think I personally won't mind a beer at my local pub with my friends. But I think, again, going back to what we are seeing in this survey, potentially where we see is that people are talking about reconnecting with loved ones. In round one, we saw this whole theme around people saying that, I want to enjoy, or I appreciate the simpler things in life. So clearly, it points towards a fact where people want to reconnect in a meaningful and authentic way. It's more about, spending time with loved ones that you haven't seen, rather than about it possibly being a big party, spendy or extravagant sort of activity. And of course, Rich, I think you were talking about, the last few slides, where people are still a bit cagey about activities that involve a lot of people, crowds around. So based on that, I would say that people are looking to connect in a very meaningful and authentic way, and basically enjoying one another's company much more than it is about the glitz and glamour of let's go out and let's party. So that's where potentially the consumer sentiment at this point of time is, to reconnect with loved ones.
Great, thank you, Bish. So I think we'll stop the Q&A there. So thanks to everyone who asked us a question. Apologies if we didn't get to your question. What we'll probably try and do is send a response to anyone who asked a question that didn't get answered there. So in the final couple of minutes, I just want to spend a bit of time, I guess, reminding everyone on the call that we are very, very focused on trying to build this program around our clients' questions. So each month we do try and suggest new topics and new angles to potentially explore further in the coming months. We then ask our Metrics Lab teams around the world to get in touch with our clients and identify which of those questions are most relevant and most important. So we want to orient those questions around a framework that we've adopted that maps our progress through the different phases of the pandemic. Ultimately gets us to that ultimate goal of understanding and defining the new normal. At the moment, we believe that many countries are entering what we call the restricted living phase. So that means that restrictions are beginning to lift, but there is still a big impact on lifestyles and routines. So in this context, the kind of questions that we're focused on really related to understanding how people are changing, but specifically which of those changes are likely to stick with us in the future once we emerge from the crisis. So that's really guiding our thinking around the 3 suggested topics that we have for next month. So those topics are, first of all, how do we see emotional needs continuing to evolve as more countries enter this restricted living phase? Secondly, we know that value is rising up the consumer agenda. Is that coming at the expense of sustainability? So is that being deprioritized? Or because more people are now able to look towards the future, is sustainability actually rising up the agenda? And then the third potential topic would be essentially what's next for the cautious consumer. Do we see consumers getting more relaxed over the course of time? Do they start to feel more confident about doing more activities? Or does that caution persist? So a member of your Metrics Lab team will be in touch to understand which of those topics is most relevant to you and your business. But for now, I think I'll close the session. So thanks again for joining us. We really hope that you can take this learning back into your businesses to inform some of the actions that you are taking. A copy of the report will be made available to you. It will be sent over to you, so don't worry about that. And we hope to see you again next time. So until then, thank you and goodbye.
Thanks, everyone.